Hello, Regina. Welcome to Revision Chats. It's a pleasure to be with you today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good to see you, Maria. And yeah, I'm having a good day.
Fantastic. Well, today we're going to talk about a number of things with Regina. And the first, let's just start with what was one salient thing you got out of your revision journey?
Absolutely. I think, as we've talked about, the big thing for me, a big part of it was community. And as it happens, I was so lucky to land in this community, and particularly in this cohort, which I'm happy to say continues to this day. So yeah, part of it was the people who came together for this work have a particular perspective that I think I was very interested in. I have a background as a poet and an English teacher and a bit of a performer, and I do work in corporate. And so sort of blending those two worlds, has been my kind of lifelong career dream, actually. And sometimes it goes well and sometimes it just feels scary all the time, Whereas in this community, there's a real commitment to bringing all of who you are and the deeper resonance of who you are. It feels very much like people come to this community because they're drawn to specifically that. So for me, it was perfect. And I happened to land in a cohort where people had these huge HR corporate jobs. And on the one hand, I thought, oh, perfect, great networking for me from a corporate perspective or something. And it turned out, of course, we were sharing conversation all the time. But what happened in this way of working was that we just became so personally connected to one another. And I think that's the sustaining piece, because we were all coming at this from a place of personal change, as well as an interest in driving professional change. And so there was just this kind of perfect serendipity that put us together and made us support one another, or gave us the opportunity to support one another in that work. And it was confidence building, frankly, on both levels, right? Both from the perspective of personal change, where you have this group of people urging you on to what you most deeply want. And then you can take that out sort of professionally. And that's basically where our conversations sort of started to move. And then it would come back to the personal. So it's really interesting. You and I have talked about this, like, what really does sustain that connection? Is it personal or is it professional? And I really think that it is the sort of rootedness in just this kind of community of care, both about one another and about the issues. But so that's the thing that really resonates for me, because it's ongoing and it's still with me, that we still get together, not as frequently, but we're very interested. And even sometimes when we've tried to put the work forward and say, are we all interested in this theme, or are we all interested in this thing? What we mostly want to do is get together and hear what everybody's up to, right? Yeah, it was it. And for me, it was just perfect timing, because I had started a new job and I was really challenged from a lot of perspectives, trying to join this new organization in the middle of COVID for me. And then also sort of a challenging client culture, very different from what I wanted to bring forward. Mm-hmm. And so I was just really up against it when this community sort of came into my life and really, buoyed me through that experience. So it was really great. And props to you for putting this sort of collection, I think sort of the attractive structure to bring people with those interests in. So I appreciate that very much.
Well, thank you for saying that. That acknowledgement goes straight to my heart because from an early age, I felt the yearning for community very deeply. Growing up in a city as an only child, in a very competitive school where community wasn't necessarily what my experience was. And I discovered it when I went to a women's college, and my life changed. And since then, I've been wanting to replicate that feeling of community, and specifically the the intimacy and the sharing and the supporting each other to unfold and to bring out the gifts that we have in the world. That's my favorite kind of community, right? Where we can be ourselves.
Sure.
We could truly be ourselves. And when I hear you bring up all the different facets that you are, the poet, the English teacher, and now the corporate woman, I'm delighted because it really seems that this community has nurtured different sides of you to come forward. How has that been like for you to welcome back maybe some parts that had been left behind?
Yeah, it's interesting. I can give you one example. So, I mentioned this project and this client engagement that I kind of dropped into the middle of, right? So, and it was very funny because in the work as it progresses from all of the deep work that you do up in the beginning, sort of bones and roots and seeds and all of these things, kind of going back through almost through your own lifetime's ancestry, I'll call it. And, and also a deeper ancestry connection. But it's interesting because, we're sharing these stories in our cohort. And I'm saying, because of the work that I'm doing, yeah, I'm really interested in this kind of digital transformation, right? I've just started a new job. So all of that is very forward for me. I'm completely focused on work, But what they're hearing is you're a writer. You're, you're an imaginative person. You have a way of expressing things. And I was just like, no, talk to them. And, I have this project over here that's really, and it was funny because they really sort of kept drawing me back, like writing, Regina. And so I did start journaling. And it was frankly hard to find the time. And I didn't know how it was going to show up, to your point about, how has this evolved? I think in some ways I'm still integrating. I'm still waiting for that, because I do have this bifurcation between who I am as a professional person and who I am natively, right? And you and I have talked about that a little. It does get sort of acculturated out in some ways, and particularly in hugely successful organizations. And so that's almost like a culture that you're moving into. So we come to this place in the project. It's been, I think, probably about 9 months in, and I've had really challenging relationships, organization. We're combining 2 different companies. That connection isn't necessarily going well because we have more of a competitive thing than a collaborative thing. I mean, every possible issue is up. And it comes to Labor Day in the US, and we finally have a day off. And I just decide that I'm going to send out a poem by Marge Piercy. And it's about like the value of work. And it's just got these really rich images about working really hard together and, passing the bags along, to sort of shore up the dam, or to, I think at one point she calls it, kind of harnessing yourself like an ox, and moving things forward as you need to. And I sent this out to this team of corporate people who hadn't always gotten along well, but we had managed to move things forward. And I think that was really interesting. It was kind of like this spacious moment, and I was able to use it and sort of insert myself. And it was a little bit of a statement of who I am and what I appreciate in them. And I think it did sort of maybe slightly start to shift things. It wasn't as if, it was an overnight change, but it was like a kind of resonant appreciation. And just that little thing, I think, that's the way it starts showing up is I start finding courage to do things like that, to send a message that's out of my more authentic self, or to be, um, you know, even in a sense of opportunity spotting, like this is the place where this is the kind of conversation where I actually feel comfortable bringing this self forward. This is what safety feels like. And for me, it wasn't going to be in a project meeting. It wasn't going to be when we were talking about deadlines. It was waiting for the moment. But even being able to recognize that and to know very clearly what safety feels like, and then to be able to take a safe moment, recognize the safe opportunity and say, okay, now it's time to take a risk and see if we can bring this conversation deeper. That's what it's felt like to me. And I think it's still evolving. I would love to have more of those moments, frankly, but that was a big one, I think for me and for the team. So,
No, that's so beautiful, Regina. As you spoke, I was imagining the threads of your being coming together, the poet and the corporate woman, and through the cracks, finding those opportunities to come forward with new gifts for the world and your company in particular. That's so inspiring. Yeah. And that makes me think of an earlier conversation we had about you being committed to being a change maker. And that is so aligned to what we do at Revision Academy to empower change agents like yourself to show up in your light and your power and your authenticity and do it in your own way, as you said, with a poem. How beautiful. And I also recognize that showing up as a change maker is not always easy, because we tend to immerse ourselves in a culture, and shifting that culture can be quite challenging from the inside, as you're doing. So maybe you can speak a little bit to that experience, because probably there's many listeners here who also identify as change makers, and how to bring that voice forward in an authentic way, and in a way that, as you say, it's safe and it's congruent with who you are.
Yeah, and I think, we started talking about community, and to me, it does connect back. So I always think of these two communities that we're moving in, right? There's sort of the object of change, if you think of it that way, but you have a belonging there, and you have to know the language of that community. You have to be able to, if I think back in my career, even transitioning from an English teacher to somebody in corporate, I came in, I started writing just reference documents because I knew how to write and document, but I didn't know the language of business. And it was a huge liability until I actually learned and took on that vocabulary and the understanding of how we talk about these types of things that I might know, but I don't know how to talk about them here, right? And so, so you need your connection into that community. But then there's this other community that is supporting that more deeply resonant self, right? Or, what's emergent even. And we talked about safety and the safety for things to sort of be experimented with, or, explore the emergence of things there. And even as I was thinking about the poetry, our cohort leader, Stella, who was just so fabulous. It wasn't as if I even invented that. She did that with us constantly. She was bringing these things forward. And she was somebody who, for me, knew the language of business, but also with us, with all these business people on the line, was exemplifying complete comfort with sending out a poem or doing a long meditation that was body-centered at the start of our calls and giving us the experience of what a grounded conversation really felt like. And I think that was sort of the container of an entirely different kind of trust for all of us. And so it was really fascinating to sort of have that experience in this container over here, and again be able to like touch base and have that safety to bring forward an idea or test an idea. And I think it's something we had talked about before. It's Otto Scharmer in his work calls it action confidence, right? Where you start to feel like you're not the only one with this perspective, or you're not the only one, particularly with this integrated desire. And so then you can come back into this other community as a change maker with a bit more confidence, knowing that you're not alone, knowing that there's another community to which you belong, that you almost represent in a way at that point. And so I think that's really important to bringing change forward.
Yes.
Maybe even in a non-violent way, because in both cases it's about belonging, and ultimately that's what the invitation is rooted in, is can we just expand, can we just make this belonging broader, So it moves away from this you're going to do it my way to, hey, I have a different way of connecting, of belonging. Can I invite you in? Can I find the ways to make a compelling invitation? So I think that's what that community really gave and supported me with in the process. Still ongoing. Don't have it mastered by any means, but but it's a great, it's a much more satisfying conversation for me.
Yeah. One of the principles that has guided me is something I learned from another elder like Otto Scharmer, but in this case, a woman called Margaret Wheatley. And she talks about islands of sanity. And I'm very drawn to this concept because she says, there's many aspects of mainstream culture that are broken. And we might not be able to completely change them. But we can bring new perspectives, and particularly if we have an experience of living in another cultural context, of weaving a new type of relationship amongst us, and even a new language. So this is part of what we do in Revision Journey. We use a different language to speak about our lives. We use metaphoric language, which the sages, the very wise people say that the soul speaks in symbols. The soul speaks in metaphors and in archetypes. So, even the word soul might be forbidden in certain communities because that's just not what you talk about, but I'm okay referring to it because that's really what living a life of purpose is about. It's really about tapping into our soul and living from there and communicating with that deeper part of who we are. Poetry is the same, right? And you would know that more than I. Poetry is a language of symbols, of metaphors, of imagery, because that's the language of our deeper parts. So I'm wondering how that language was for you and in service of bringing out a new part of you.
I love that. Yeah, I love the idea of, it's interesting when we talk about language. So this was the first thing that we took on as a cohort post Revision Tribe. Was we were kind of, a few of us were interested in Otto Scharmer, and but coming from our business background, we were saying, but this just is hard to translate. It's just very difficult because, for one thing, he has a very aggressive change agenda. But the way he was going, I don't know, it was just what we were talking about was language, specifically language. And I think there is this sort of translation step of, I see this program as almost restorative in a way of a lost language. You mentioned soul, and it's funny because like that. So you start a conference call in a corporate environment, and while you're waiting for people to join, people are talking about their kids, they're talking about their dogs, especially with COVID now. You see kids sometimes running in the background. You watch, even in some of our cohort calls, the kids would come up for their night hugs or something, because the time zones were different, and it's just so humanizing. And so it's not as if, and it's almost become trite in this time of COVID to talk about it, but that the human side is coming forward almost by accident, right? And at the same time, you have this focus and you have things that you need to get done and all of that, but it's not as if it's all that disruptive, unless it becomes about human drama then, and sort of expands out of control or takes over or something. But there's a lot more opportunity for it to show up. And so it is interesting, and maybe it's my own emergent action confidence or something, but there are certainly environments where the word soul would not be, comfortable to bring forward. And yet I think there's very few environments where those same participants don't have it somewhere in their lives a bit compartmentalized, right? So it's just those kind of lines that we draw. I don't know if that specifically answers your question, but that's or your comment. That's kind of what came to mind when you're speaking about it. Just again, this kind of watching for the opportunities and having this experience to know that it is resonant, and maybe it's kind of an optimism, Anna Maria, that I didn't have before the program, because at least for me, I often would get in the space of almost like this. It's sort of the feeling that's going, you get so protective, and you start to hide, or I start to hide, and you can almost create this sort of false persona of perfectionism, or however it shows up, and I think just having that ability to sort of open, and it creates opening for others. And this is something I absolutely experienced as a gay person, who was born to a Catholic family, and in my coming out process, where it was so uncomfortable for so long. And then the more I integrated my own personal comfort, the easier the conversations became, almost by magic, with people I never expected. People who I expected to be resistant were suddenly comfortable because I was comfortable. So there's all of that. A lot of it is just, I think, becoming comfortable with the whole of us.
Yes, that's beautiful. One of the values we have in Revision Academy is succulence, taking over from the succulent plants. And what you just said brought up this succulence in me. Just what you were saying. It's a feeling of like, it's full of substance and authenticity and that courage to be yourself that comes out when we feel safe, when we feel seen, when we feel that we belong. And it's so beautiful because, as you've said, we tend to hide, we tend to protect ourselves so that we can fit in. I love this distinction that Brené Brown's bring in, fitting in versus belonging. True belonging, we don't have to protect ourselves or try to fit in, but we just are. And we gain this comfort, as you say, this comfort to be and to express ourselves. And then people are comfortable to do the same. It's contagious in a good way.
Yeah.
And that's the succulence that we aim to bring about in our culture, a succulent culture where people feel free to express who they truly are. And also talk about the hardships, because it's okay to talk about how we have faced a breakdown, or we don't know, or we're confused, or it's so healthy. And for me, it's so succulent to name things as they are, because when we do that, it's I don't know, it's like a vortex of energy that brings about what's needed. It brings about the new.
This is so fascinating because we're talking about metaphors, and you're bringing forward the metaphor of succulence, which I know is a real foundation, and the logo of the program for you. And as you express it, it's such an internal appreciation of that richness contained within.
Mm-hmm.
The succulents are these, I go immediately to succulent plants. And for me, because I live in Arizona in the desert, right? And I'm not originally from there. So I'm from a different kind of territory, if you will, like where everything's green and luscious. And then I came to the desert, and it's like such a harsh environment. I mean, in some ways, it's not like miles and miles of sand either, like I first imagined, but it's a harsh environment for natural living things, right? And these succulents, that sort of desert plant succulents, I think appears to me anyway, this is my metaphor now being expressed as kind of an adaptive richness that I'm able to keep my internal richness and organic sort of lushness, right? But it gets expressed in a way that is also kind of, protected in this really harsh environment in some ways, and in its own way, really beautiful and inviting. So it's kind of interesting that you have this inside out perspective, and I'm still coming from this outside in perspective. But there is something to this. There is something rich to this succulence to sort of explore there. It's cool that the metaphor works in both directions. I have great appreciation for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I resonate deeply with your interpretation of succulents, and to go back to this idea of change agents and how harsh their conditions can be to make change happen. There's this sense that succulents, there's a life force, and there's a substance that comes from within, and that can be nurtured with certain kinds of communities, which is the type we're trying to create, nurturing that succulence, where you can bring about your gifts and your message in a harsh environment without struggle, without so much struggle, without the fight, without depleting yourself or exhausting ourselves. I mean, I've been in that place for sure. So it's a journey to bring about that wisdom that you showcased as you shared the poem with your company at the right time, in the right way, and that created an opening without resistance. And that for me is an act full of succulence. It's like bringing out your substance out in a beautiful way that is non-threatening and that's so invitational. So that's a great example of of this succulent change making that we can do to make the world a better place. So Regina, I think we can, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just to say, it's a better way of working.
Yeah.
Right? It isn't just sort of putting the invitation out there, but it's for me, something that was fun to do. So that's a whole nother shift to be explored.
Yes. Yes. And I love it that you said it's an organic process. It's still ongoing. And it's like it's weaving inside of you, these 2 or 3 facets that you have, they are integrating. And we are advocates for your integration, for you to continue to bring forward all of who you are to life. So thank you for inspiring us all to do that. So to start to close, I invite everyone who's listening to explore Revision Journey. We have a couple of modalities for this workshop. We have a 2-day course, and then we have a 10-week course. So explore taking part of this community and what it's like to be part of a succulent environment where you can feel you belong and can bring the whole of who you are. Thank you, Regina, for being such a beautiful example of this process.
Thank you for putting such a wonderful experience together with such thoughtfulness and soul.
Let's reclaim that word.
Created a great change for me.
Thank you. Take care. Blessings.